Josh Frydenberg, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Nice to be with you, Shari.
You were Australia's treasurer. You were prolific. You've basically disappeared from public life for the past 2 years. This tonight is your first major interview. What's prompted you to sit down with me today?
Well, like so many Australians, I've been really shocked by the speed and the scale in the rise of anti-Semitism after October the 7th. And I think many Australians don't know how bad and how dangerous the situation is today. So I wanted to use my voice to ring the alarm bell. I wanted to use my voice to shine a light on what is happening here in Australia today, and wanted Australians to see and hear for themselves what is happening in their own country with the rise of anti-Semitism, and to understand this is not just the Jewish community's fight, this is Australia's fight.
And so you've used your voice, you haven't just sat back and watched, you've used your voice to do something very powerful. It's a very powerful contribution to our nation. What have you done?
Well, we've put together a documentary where we've interviewed leaders from across the political spectrum, both past and present, business leaders, religious leaders, leaders from our arts community, and of course people who understand these issues from a security and intelligence perspective. We've also talked to Australians who have been directly impacted by anti-Semitism, people who have had their lives threatened, people who have lost their jobs, people who have seen their businesses close as a result of the intimidation, the hate and the violence directed towards them simply because they're Jewish.
Look, it's an incredible documentary. We're going to give our viewers tonight the very first look at Josh Frydenberg's new documentary. Here it is.
Did you believe, after surviving the Holocaust, that you would ever feel unsafe in Australia simply because you were Jewish?
Never.
What's happening now, it's the same ideology, suddenly turning and becoming really hostile against Jews.
People need to be aware that this is happening.
One thing we must unite on is to completely repudiate any return of anti-Semitism. They were words of hate.
The philosophy of some level of extermination.
Surely, in modern Australia, we're better than that.
Just a little bit of anti-Semitism is okay. That thought has crept into the national psyche or into the psyche of some of our leaders.
People will have different views about Israel, about Palestine.
If you, as a Holocaust survivor, had the opportunity to speak to the Prime Minister of Australia today.
Be aware of what's going on around you. Speak out for us. Lead.
What's your message to these Holocaust survivors?
That Australians stand with you, that we're honoured to have you as part of our Australian community.
Speak out on the right side of history.
That is so powerful, Josh. This is such an important cause to give your time and energy to do all those amazing interviews. We saw there you were in tears. This is very emotional. It's personal for you. It's not just politics. Can you tell me a bit about your family history and why this is so close to home for you?
Well, my family story is not unique. Like many Australian Jewish families, we've lost many relatives in the Holocaust. My mother was a survivor. She came with her family to Australia with nothing, and Australia opened its arms. It gave my mum a fresh start and a safe place to live. And the reason why I wanted to do this documentary is what I've seen over the last 6 months has meant that warm embrace that were given to Holocaust survivors by this country and the safety that these Holocaust survivors had in Australia is now under threat.
Look, we saw their very strong message from several Holocaust survivors. They're saying to the Prime Minister, be on the right side of history. They're saying you need to do more. What are your reflections on the political leadership we've seen in Australia right from the top since October 7?
Well, I think if you look right across the board, our institutions, law enforcement, and of course in politics, I think there has been a failure of leadership. I think we've seen unacceptable conduct, not as unique individual circumstances, but we've seen many examples across the board, from the Sydney Opera House and what happened there just days after the October 7 attacks, to the riots in Caulfield, to the doxing of Jewish creatives, to the boycotting of Jewish owned businesses, to the harassment, to the intimidation. And these Holocaust survivors, who are proud Australians, are saying, many of them, they no longer feel safe in Australia. So that has been a failure of leadership across the board. And what your viewers tonight need to understand is this is not just a Jewish problem or a Jewish challenge. This is Australia's problem and Australia's challenge and Australia's fight, because the values of tolerance and diversity are core Australian values, and they've been thrown out the door in the last 6 months. And Bari Weiss, a very well-known American journalist, she has said, when anti-Semitism goes from the shameful fringe to the public square, it's actually an early warning. It's an early warning about the decline of our society. And that's the alarm bells that should be going off right around Australia right now.
Yeah, look, it's been such a shock, and the alarm bells aren't just going off around Australia, but this failure of political leadership that we've seen here, this lack of courage, is reflected internationally as well. Virtually, we've seen hatred on the streets of London, of Paris, of the United States. Where do you think this hatred is coming from?
Well, when I look at the leadership around the world, I agree there has been a failure up to this point. And it seems that our leaders are seeking the path of least resistance. And they should know better. You can't appease the mob. And that is why we need to set very clear red lines and ensure that they're now not crossed. And yet they have been crossed. There's been a green light given to the crossing of those red lines over the last 6 months. Anti-Semitism's always been there. I mean, you know it well, Shari, it feeds off conspiracy theories, whether the Jews were the communists or the Jews were the capitalists. They were always the reason for society's ills. But now we're seeing something a lot more pervasive and a lot more dangerous. And what has been particular about the last 6 months is the explosion of anti-Semitism on the far left. And the far left have demonised Israel and wrongly portrayed it as the oppressor, as the coloniser, as the apartheid state. And we know that is not the case. So those on the far left have convinced themselves that they're actually fighting racism when they're actually promoting racism with their anti-Semitic and anti-Israel behaviour.
I mean, they've basically been tolerating it and thus allowing it to fester. I mean, you compare the political leadership we're seeing today with Australia's past prime ministers who you interviewed, John Howard, Julia Gillard. These will be Julia Gillard's first comments on anti-Semitism in the past 7 months. Was she shocked at the rise in anti-Semitism that we're seeing in our country?
Well, John Howard and Julia Gillard are no fair weather friends of either the Jewish community or the State of Israel, and their comments were extremely powerful on the program because they understood what Israel represents as a beacon of democracy in a sea of hostility in that region, but also the great innovation and the great know-how that Israel has helped provide the world, but also the contribution here in Australia of the Jewish community. And both Julia Gillard and John Howard spoke of that contribution in philanthropy, in the arts, in the medical profession, and of course in the defence of our nation with Sir John Monash. And so their comments, I think, were really strong and very clear about how the events that we've seen after October the 7th in Australia are clearly unacceptable. They've been affected by it, and they want Australia to change course and to reset this debate.
I'm really looking forward to seeing both John Howard and Julia Gillard's comments, your interviews with them. Now, I mean, you mentioned Sir John Monash. The university campuses have been the place where anti-Semitism has been most overt. The young students, young Jewish students who go there have really been suffering daily harassment and abuse. This is an international phenomenon, but it's also at Sydney University, it's at Monash, it's at Melbourne University, it's at ANU. We've even seen students openly support Hamas. How can students be so devoid of morals, of reason, to support a terrorist organisation that slaughtered entire families?
Well, Shari, just in the last week, you've seen a terrorist flag foisted at one of our universities here in Australia. You've seen students openly praise a listed terrorist organisation here in Australia, namely Hamas. You've heard them chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which is an inherently violent statement about the abolition of the State of Israel. You've heard them glorify the globalisation of the Intifada, which was a suite of suicide bombings that, took thousands of innocent lives. This is happening under the noses of our university leaders. And I feel very strongly about this. I think some of our university leaders have been derelict in their duty to maintain a safe campus. At the very least, they're in breach of their own principles and their own bylaws about promoting freedom of speech, subject to the creation of a safe space for their students. You cannot say that these campuses are safe spaces when this type of incitement to violence, this type of behaviour is going on. And you mentioned Monash University. I mean, the students at Monash, some of them, are now saying they no longer want Zionists on their campus. Well, I've got a message for those students. They should choose another campus because Monash University is named after the great Sir John Monash, who was the foundation president of the Zionist Federation of Australia, a proud Zionist. Our greatest general, a proud Zionist, of whom the university is named after. And here you have, in 2024, the students saying we don't want Zionists on campus. If that's not enough of a message to our university leaders that something is deeply, deeply wrong with the leaders of tomorrow, then I don't know what is.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like they're allowing the students to run riot, and the students have no sense of history, no knowledge. But the other point is that Zionism has almost become a dirty word. There's nothing wrong with being a Zionist. The majority of Jewish people, probably 90 or 95%, would be Zionists. It's just agreeing with the existence of a Jewish homeland.
And you hear that in the documentary, and we know from the President of the United States down, they openly talk about being proud Zionists. And again, this is the misuse of language that is being deployed in a violent way and in a very dangerous way. And you have now a generation of young people who have been brought up on a diet of disinformation. They've got their information from YouTube and from TikTok.
And from university lecturers, by the way.
And I agree with that. And not reading the books, not understanding the lessons of history. There's been some alarming surveys in the United States which have found more than half of young people have no knowledge of the details of the Holocaust, the tragedy which saw 6 million Jews killed, 1.5 million children, as anti-Semitism, played out in the most evil of ways.
Yeah. Now, you've just accused the university chancellors and vice-chancellors of a dereliction of duty in allowing this to continue. But what's your response to Federal Education Minister Jason Clare, who says that anti-Israel slogans chanted at the universities, like calling for a global intifada and from the river to the sea, he says they mean different things to different people?
Well, I think the Education Minister should get an education, and he should go down to the Sydney Jewish Museum and sit down with Holocaust survivors and hear firsthand for himself about where anti-Semitism leads. They were tone-deaf comments at best. Ignorant in the extreme. There is no equivalence here. These are not legitimate slogans. These are slogans calling for the genocide of the Jewish people. And when Jason Clare watches this documentary and hears from leaders of this country, not just political, not just from his own side of politics, but he hears from security experts about how dangerous these slogans are, he may need to rethink his misguided comments.
Very strong comments there, Josh Frydenberg. We've been speaking about the failure of political leadership, the failure of leadership at the universities. Well, let's talk about some solutions. What do you think our leaders today need to do to address this crisis that's consuming Australia?
Well, the first point is that they need to understand the depth of the problem and recognise that we are in a crisis. The second point is that they need to know that themselves have a responsibility to take urgent action. And that urgent action may be unpopular in some quarters. It may be difficult, there may be pushback, but that's what leaders do. They take risks. We hear that in the documentary from Holocaust survivors who say leaders take risks. You know, Elie Wiesel, the Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor, said indifference is the most insidious and dangerous form of behaviour, right? Because turning a blind eye to what is happening is not an option. So I think there needs to be a recognition of urgent action. And the solution lies in both soft and hard power. Soft power in the sense education. We need to educate not just the education minister, but the next generation of leaders about where anti-Semitism leads, how it corrodes a society, how it consumes people in the hate of it. And by doing so, we can help breed a better view. We can help widen the lens for the next generation of leaders about their behaviour. And then when it comes to hard power, it's about enforcing the law. And the documentary goes into that in quite a lot of detail. To think that those scenes outside the Opera House, the scenes outside in Caulfield, the doxing of Jewish creatives, the destroying of people's livelihoods have not seen consequences.
No one arrested.
No one being arrested. That in itself should tell all those people watching your program tonight that the response to date has been far from adequate.
There's also been widespread concern within Australia about the foreign policy approach that Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong have taken to Israel, mostly since October 7. This has led to a fracturing of the Australia-Israel relationship. Does this concern you? And having recently returned from Israel, what's your message to those who say that there needs to be an immediate ceasefire? Do you think Israel should be supported in its war, in its mission to destroy Hamas?
Well, what you hear in the documentary from both past and present political leaders, and that, whether it's Anthony Albanese or John Howard, is that Hamas has no place in the peace negotiations that will no doubt take place over time in Israel. That Hamas is a listed terrorist organisation and that it's an impediment to a more peaceful future in the Middle East. So its military capability has to be dismantled as far as possible, and there's a recognition of that from the Australian leadership. With respect to the Australia-Israel relationship, it's got a very proud history, particularly on the Labor side, whether it was Doc Evatt, who was president of the UN General Assembly when Israel was established, to Bob Hawke, who said, if the bell tolls for Israel, the bell tolls for all of mankind, to Julie Gillard, Bill Shorten and others. They've been proud supporters and defenders of the State of Israel. But what we hear in this program is how important the security relationship is between our two countries, in that Israel's intelligence and security know-how has helped save Australian lives. So it is important that relationship continue. You can have differences of policies, and you can agree to have different views on some key issues. That's what a good bilateral relationship must be about. But at the same time, the fundamental relationship between Australia and Israel has served both countries well to now, and I hope it does into the future.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot of interest in your documentary, as there should be. How do you feel about returning to the public arena?
Well, I've really enjoyed putting together this documentary with the team from Sky, who've been extremely professional as we've done this, and I think it's super important. As I said at the start, Shari, I don't think many Australians know how bad and how dangerous the situation is. Yeah. And what we're seeing on our universities, instead of education, we've seen indoctrination. What we've seen on our streets is violence, intimidation. What we've heard from people in the documentary Holocaust survivors is they no longer feel safe in Australia. They are reliving their worst nightmares, and that's not good enough. So we all have a collective responsibility, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. It's in Australia's interest to get this right.
Yeah. Josh, from the moment I mentioned to my viewers that you were coming on my program tonight, there's only one thing everybody wants to know. When are you returning to federal politics?
I'm not rushing back. I'm really enjoying family life, coaching the local footy team, and enjoying my work in the private sector. But I'm not saying never ever.
So the next election's in about a year's time. It should be early 2025. So you're thinking the election after that could be 2028? That's
a lifetime away, Shari. I'm sure we'll speak more between now and then, but I'm really enjoying my life. It's been an opportunity to spend really precious time with the family. I'm loving the work in the private sector, and I've kept my relationships up. And hopefully what this program does is it shows it's not about partisanship. It shows that we're not playing left versus right here. What we're seeking to do is ensure a bipartisan commitment to making Australia a better place into the future, because this program is all about ensuring that this is seen as Australia's fight and that we have a better Australia ahead.
100%. Congratulations on the documentary.